Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm doing something a little bit different than the TV show episodes and movie reviews that I normally do. This time I'm actually going to be reviewing one of my favorite book series. And this is the 1632 series, also known, actually better known, as the Ring of Fire series by author Eric Flint. Now, to tell you what this series is about was actually kind of complicated. So I'll just read the back of the cover to the first book in the series because that really summarizes it much better than I ever could. So it starts off. 1632. In northern Germany, things couldn't get much worse. Famine, disease, religious wars laying waste to cities. Only the aristocrats remained relatively unscathed. For the peasants, death was a mercy. 2000. Things are all going okay in Grantville, West Virginia, and everybody attending the wedding of Mike Stern's sister, including the local chapter of the United Mine Workers of America, which Mike leads, is having a good time. Then in big bold letters it says, "Then everything changed." When the dust settles, Mike leads a group of armed miners to find out what happened and finds the road into town is cut, as with a sword. On the other side, a scene out of hell. A man nailed to a farmhouse door, his wife and daughter attacked by men in steel vests. Faced with this, Mike and his friends don't have to ask who to shoot. At that moment, freedom and justice, American style, are introduced to the middle of the 30 Years' War. Well, all right. That is a somewhat. That's okay. So yes, basically the idea is that in this series, the small town of Grantville, West Virginia, population roughly 3,000 people, give or take, is through a cosmic accident transported across time and space and switches place with a patch of Germany, of northern Germany, in the middle of the 30 Years' War. And it's explained right in the few early pages of the novel what happens and how this happens. And hey, spoiler, it's because of aliens dicking around with something they shouldn't. But one of the first very nice things about this series is the people in this town are ultimately just completely mystified as to how this happened. There is no super brilliant scientist who happens to be conveniently around to explain everything or to figure out the mystery. The people just have to accept that something crazy happened and our entire town has been transported back in time to to Germany in the middle of this terrible war. And it now is established that this incident has basically caused the world in which they are living in to split off into its own timeline, and that, of course, history has been dramatically altered. And this is really basically the crux of what the Ring of Fire series is called. And for those of you who are wondering, the event that transported them through time is ultimately what people start to call the Ring of Fire. It produces a perfect circle of 6 miles around this town that was transported back in time. And as I said, this is basically the changes that this causes is basically what this series is about. Now, I want you guys to stop and think about just the implications of what this is. Imagine how much, for a moment, just how much the world has changed in the almost 400 years since this time. And this is really, basically one of the big ideas is, if you were to take ideas and the knowledge that we have today, even a limited amount of it, would produce extraordinarily huge changes if you were to introduce it 400 years in the past. Imagine if you were just to grab a guy or any man or woman out of line at, say, your local Walmart, throw them back into time to the year 1632, and position things so that they would not immediately be killed, but could actually have people who were in some degree of authority listen to them. Just what you and I would consider common, everyday, completely unremarkable knowledge is information that could transform the world of the early 17th century. Knowledge of things like the existence of germs. People then did not know that germs existed. Now, if you stop and think for just a second how knowledge of the existence of germs transformed medicine, it's incredible. Or the simple knowledge that you can prevent a lot of diseases by simply washing your hands regularly. Again, this is a revolutionary idea in the world of 1632 that you and I think nothing of. And it's not just things like, basic knowledge, basic hygiene. It's other ideas, things that you and I, as residents of the modern world, really just sort of take as a universal fact, as a given that we take for granted. Now, one of the big changes that I'm talking about, for example, is think about the position of women in Europe in the early 17th century. This is really not a terribly great time to be female. But if you introduce some women from the year 2000, which is incidentally when this book, of course, came out, so there's no references to anything, of course, that happened after that. But anyway, of course, them coming from the early 21st century were raised or grew up during the time with the idea of equality between the genders, and needless to say, the women of the time from the 20th century, just so I can make this more clearly. Ultimately, they end up calling the people who were transported back in time uptimers, and the residents of the 17th century downtimers. So, I'm going to just keep using those terms just to make explaining this stuff a lot easier. The uptimer women are naturally not too pleased by the ordinary roles that women of the 17th century have. And once they're introduced to the ideas like gender equality and education for women, not surprisingly, the downtimer women get behind this extraordinarily enthusiastically. And it's certainly not as if the men, the uptimer guys, are terribly happy at the way women are, treated by 17th century standards. Yeah, I mean, even people from a small town in a rather conservative place like West Virginia would really just not consider a lot of what was going on then to be acceptable. I mean, granted, people in small towns can be somewhat narrow-minded, but you'd have to really search pretty high and low in the modern era to find somebody who would deny that girls should go to school. But again, this is another example of something that you and I just take as a universal, accepted, unquestionable idea. But if you were to plant that in the early 17th century, again, it's revolutionary. And that's, again, as I said, this is one of the big things. It's really not about American politics. As much as I enjoy the series, I kind of am bothered by the way they choose to phrase that on the back of the book. It actually put me off a little bit because I was really worried that this was going to be some kind of gung-ho America rah 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 stuff. And there is, the occasional one or two moments of that in the first book where people do sort of champion the virtues that Americans tend to hold very dear. But to be perfectly honest, that falls by the wayside very, very quickly. The idea that any American virtues are particularly championed, it really sort of diminishes. It really focuses more, the series I mean, on these universal things that you and I, in not just the United States, but really in just the 21st century modern world, take, and seeing those ideas taking root, spreading, and changing the world of the 17th century. Things like religious tolerance, equality for women, universal education, and so many other things. And seeing how these ideas take root and grow and change and come to fruition in this new world that has been created is really what the series is about. Now, of course, not all of this goes over with the people of the 17th century, automatically. I mean, there is most certainly not any idea of, people falling down on their knees and going, oh, teach us your ways, oh, brilliant and almighty Americans. No, no, no. That is absolutely, positively not going on. Because, well, as the people learn, from the uptimers learn, first of all, that the way societies work back then aren't done because people are just stupid or evil or anything ridiculously simplistic like that. Societies in the 17th century, just like in today, are complicated things. That people do things for complicated reasons sometimes. And that you just can't go into societies, wave a magic wand, and expect them to transform overnight. Things take time. And sometimes people are going to object to changes, sometimes because they are just simply afraid of change, and sometimes because they have genuinely legitimate concerns. And I do like that Eric Flint is very good about this. Sometimes there are characters in the stories who are simply bad guys. They oppose these changes simply because they don't want to lose power, or they want their nation to be powerful. Others are people who are simply have understandable fears that this is all very, very big stuff. And if you have a feeling that your home, your country, is going to take a really, really major and dramatic shift due to reasons that you don't fully understand, well, okay, it's understandable that people would be afraid or nervous or wary of all of this. And that I do like that this is all presented. And another thing that Flint is really good at is he's really very good at sort of answering the sort of logical questions, like how people are going to in this town are going to get food. What about gasoline? What happens when they start running out of spare parts for stuff? What kind of technological level can they maintain? Now, and he explains all of this in very easy to understand terms. And it's even said, we can't keep all of this 21st century, technological goodness going forever because, this is just a small town. We don't have the resources to make a lot of the things that we would need in order to, maintain this 21st century lifestyle. But of course, and this is another thing that they go into at great lengths, is that there are addendums to these books where they sort of have people who are experts on stuff talk about, like, well, could you, for example, get a telegraph to work in the 16th century? I'm sorry, if you had a certain degree of knowledge and resources. Now, as the series wears on, there's quite a book, but there's, I believe, currently 9 books in the main Ring of Fire series, and then there are some, I don't exactly want to call them spin-off books, but they're basically anthologies of shorter stories, sometimes written by Eric Flint, some of them written by other authors who just kind of wanted to play in the sandbox, but are overseen and given official approval by Flint himself. There's quite a few of these out there. This is one of them that I happen to have. They're called, the main ones are called the Grantville Gazettes, and there's another occasional series that comes out that are just simply called The Ring of Fire. And as I said, these are just sort of shorter stories by different authors that most of them are just sort of there to be little side stories that add to things. Just for example, there was one story that I read not too long ago that was dealing with one woman's efforts to preserve the various animals that were transported back in time with them and are now sort of taking root and spreading out across Europe. Another one that was about, jeez, I am totally starting to blank here, is about, oh yeah, I'm sorry, how the play version of The Sound of Music sort of really ends up getting performed in Austria and is an enormous hit there. Another one that is was the high school, local high school eventually goes and actually puts on a production of Guys and Dolls, and this ends up inspiring some of the Downtimer people to form their own version of the Salvation Army. And there are lots and lots of these stories in the various anthologies, and again, most of them are just sort of little ideas that are there to kind of make the universe richer. But again, all of this is overseen and given the approval by Eric Flint. So he's more than once he will go and take characters from these side stories and use them in the main book series. Now, naturally, you don't have to actually read any of these side anthologies as long as you stick with the main series. Eric Flint is very, very good about explaining who people are, what their deal is, what's going on, and yeah. Now, let's start talking about some of the downsides to this series, and the main one is actually just basically what I said, that there are a lot of authors out there who come in to these anthologies and contribute stories. And while most of them are pretty good, or at least okay, as it tends to be when you let a lot of chefs in the kitchen, well, there's just flat out just going to be the occasional story that is just a flat out turkey. One of my favorite examples, there was a story that was about a woman who survived basically survived her encounter with Elizabeth Bathory, the famous Blood Countess. A woman who's inspired many stories about vampires over the years. Now, and she eventually finds refuge in Grantville. Now, when I first read it, they're like, oh wow, this sounds like it could be a really awesome story. And no, it's not. It's that aspect of the story is really just a very minor thing, and it's really, at the end of the day, just a bunch of people talking about 21st century Calvinism versus 17th century Calvinism. And I'm certainly not saying this is any particular knock on Calvinism. I really don't know enough of the details about what Calvinists believe to have any real opinion about it one way or the other. But it just sort of feels like such a bait and switch. And then there are other stories where it's basically there to just sort of wax poetic about whatever topic is particular to that author's interests. And again, this can be very good or this can be very bad. It just really depends on the story. And some of them are just not that great. There was a story that was talking about, some of the locals who were had a bit of a talent for ballet, and how you introduce people 21st century ideas about ballet versus 17th century ideas about ballet. And it's just like, do I really give a crap about ballet? I mean, no. I mean, I'm sure there are people out there who are extremely passionate about ballet and all this other stuff, but they're the only people who are really going to give a rat's ass about that particular story. And well, the other main one is that, of course, this is set in the early 17th century, and this is honestly a time that I really didn't know very much about. I vaguely have recalled in my history classes in school hearing about the 30 Years' War once or twice, but if you were to say, what was the deal with the 30 Years' War? Well, I'd be able to tell you that it was a war that happened in Europe that lasted about 30 years, but beyond that, I wouldn't be able. I really didn't know a clue, know a thing about it. And now Eric Flint, is of course very talented guy who does his homework quite well. So all the details that you need to understand what's going on are included in the novel. But sometimes you have to sometimes you have to sit through a pretty lengthy info dump in order to get a full picture of what's going on. There was one story that was in the anthology series, and it was basically about a uptime farmer who wanted to buy some land. And I kid you not, folks, there were 5 pages going on and on about the complexities of how it was that you bought and exchanged, how real estate changed hands in early 17th century Germany. Now, granted, this was stuff that you did need to understand what was going on in the story, but still, it was 5 pages of this stuff. And I just really wanted to smash my head with a cinder block trying to get through that, because it's just, I don't care. Can we just get on with it? Now, to be completely fair to himself, this is something that Eric Flint does improve with over the course of the series. One of the more recent books, he even had a character who was an academic sort of realize that this sort of big wordy bunch of stuff that she was going to put in a book that she was writing might be of interest to academics like herself, but would bore the pants off of ordinary people. And I will say that as time goes by, the series just continues to get better and better. The characters are more fleshed out, and Flint, he overcomes some of the flaws that he has in his early novels. Now, this is one of the first book is actually still one of my very favorites in the series, but it does come with some flaws. One of the main ones is that one of the big characters in the series, a fellow by the name of John Simpson. He's he's a big time businessman who happens to be in Grantville because his son is getting married to a local girl. And as the series wears on, as I said, Simpson becomes a very important character. But in the first book, he's just portrayed as this sort of cartoonish big businessman bad guy. Now, in the later books, we really start to get into his character, who he is. He starts to take on a very important role in what's going on, and he becomes a very compelling character to follow. I enjoy the scenes with him, and he's, again, just a very enjoyable character. But really, at the very start of the series, he's an almost cartoonish villain. And that is really one of my big ones right there. Now, I haven't really said too much about the characters in this series, simply because there are a lot of them, and I mean a lot, and which is understandable, because this is a series that's spread out over 9 main books and a whole bunch of other little side books and anthologies. So again, there's a lot of people to keep juggling in the air, and these are just the folks who are uptime. There's not to consider the downtime people. Again, there are loads and loads of characters, which is why many of these books actually seem to include sort of a list of all the characters' names, who they are, what their role is, and all this other stuff, which is at times necessary. So again, that I'm sure for some people can be a bit of a mark against it. But at the end of the day, the main character of the series I would consider to be, as it's mentioned on the back of this book, to be Mike Stearns. And he's the leader, as it is, of the local miners' union, and ultimately ends up sort of becoming the leader of the uptimers once they've realized what's going on. And Mike is a really good character. He's a guy, it's very easy to cheer for him. He's a very smart man. But at the end of the day, my real problem with Mike is that he's just a little bit too good. Mike is portrayed and is even referred to several times as quite the magnificent bastard. And I do love that particular term, which is very fitting for Mike. As a union guy, he's used to dealing with high stakes negotiations. He's used to thinking about terms and things in terms of politics, about organizing people, getting people to listen to him, to follow him, all of which makes him a really good choice for leader in this particular situation. But the problem is that Mike just doesn't really make very many mistakes. He doesn't really seem to screw up. He doesn't really fail very often. It just seems like things almost always seem to go Mike's way. Now, to be completely fair, bad things do happen. Plans fail. People die. But at the end of the day, Mike Stearns always seems to walk away a winner. And that bothers me a little bit. It's just, he at times seems just to be a little too good to be true. Now, that's not to say that I don't like Mike as a character. When Mike is really, really pulling his magnificent bastard act, it is a thing of beauty to read. And I guess another thing that I should say in complete fairness to the series is that I like the way that a lot of people from downtime are portrayed. I like that they do not, even for a minute, cast these people as just simply being stupid. They are people from a different period in history, and naturally they have very different ways of looking at the world. But there are people in the world, and it's made very clear that these people are not dumb. The people of the 17th century are very savvy people, very quick to adapt. There are people who are just as just as slick and good at being magnificent bastards out there as Michael Stearns is. The main one of the series, who's kind of an antagonist, is Cardinal Richelieu of France, a pretty famous guy if you have any real knowledge of French history. And there are other people that pop up throughout here that are, again, real heavy hitters in that period of time. The King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, the guy who was called the Lion of the North, the Golden General, one of the most famous generals in history. He is a big and very important character in this series. Guys like Pappenheim, Wilhelm Wettin. You really can't help but learn quite a bit about the history of this time while reading this series, and it's actually quite enjoyable. Now let me see here. But yeah, as I was saying, the people from the downtimers are not portrayed as superstitious, stupid people. I was really kind of also worried that when they were introduced to this uptime technology, that people were going to run around and start screaming about witchcraft and all this other stuff. Well, that doesn't happen. Even in the early 17th century, people were familiar with the concept of basic machinery. And they understand the idea that, oh, that's not magic or sorcery or anything like that. It's just a machine. It's more complicated than anything I'm familiar with, but it has, gears and, little bits of metal that do this and that. And, they're able to understand that this is something that is not the result of magic, but just simply the work of men. And at the end of the day, I guess it's simplest to say that I like that the series is respectful to the people of the 17th century. It shows that they are intelligent people capable of reason and understanding just as much as you or I are, which is not to say that there aren't people, both up and down time, who are stupid or pig-headed or morally bankrupt, because there are. The people from the future are not universally portrayed as good, and the people from the past are not universally portrayed as bad. Just like how in even any small town, you would find a mixture of people who are good, who are bad, who are somewhere in the middle. And at the end of the day, the way I really do like that Flint basically treats everyone as intelligent people capable of reason, capable of making rational decisions, capable of opening their minds to new ideas. Now, not everybody does this, but people are at least portrayed as thinking beings. Not just caricatures or just sort of ridiculous stereotypes. I mean, a lot of the people in the series who are big characters who I really love, like Rui Sanchez and Gretchen Richer, Eddie Junker, are people who are downtimers, and oh man, are they cool? Princess Christina, Gustavus Adolphus, Prince Ulrich of Denmark. I mean, there are some characters from the past who are just absolutely fantastic, who I absolutely love just as much as anybody from the 21st century, even though naturally I am more inclined to be able to understand the people from the 21st century. Okay, so I have the feeling that since I've been talking for about half an hour, it might be a good idea to start wrapping this somewhat rambling review up. And let me just do that by saying this, that no author is perfect, no work of fiction is perfect. But at the end of the day, Eric Flint's Ring of Fire series is an extremely enjoyable read. If you, like me, love history, and I do love history. My favorite channel on TV is the History Channel. You cannot read this series and not really learn an awful lot about this extremely fascinating period of European history. And the ideas and the way that this show presents the power of ideas is really wonderful. I like how it's even stated at one point in the series that after Grantville is transported back in time, the local high school library becomes the greatest repository of knowledge on the entire planet. And if you stop and think about it, that's true. One of the major themes of this series is the power of knowledge. And it's also another one of them is the repudiation of the great man theory of history. And this is simply the idea that it is the big people, the Abraham Lincolns, the Genghis Khans, the Gandhis, the Queen Victorias, the really famous people of the world that are ultimately the ones who really change history, and that the ordinary people of the world really don't matter. And this series is very much about that. There is no brilliant super scientist or anything like that who got sucked back in time along with Granville. There are just a lot of ordinary, decent people who want to use what it is they have to try and make the world in which they suddenly find themselves a decent and good place. And Flint makes a pretty strong case that this is really workable. That it is the simple acts of ordinary people and their willingness to fight for what they believe in and to champion their ideas, that this is really what changes history. And watching these ideas ripple out and change the world of Europe and if you read the anthologies, and you see that the ripples eventually spread across the world to even the New World. There's even one story where basically it gets as far away as places like Tibet and Japan. And it all just makes for really fascinating, very interesting reading. So again, for people who really like history or alternate history, this series is a real treat. Now, granted, there are flaws. There are the occasional stories out there that are just plain turkeys. The most famous one probably being the Dreesen incident, which is one of the novels in the main series. Sadly, my advice is to kind of just skip over that one. You really aren't missing much. But at the end of the day, like I said, there are some flaws with the series, but it is ultimately some really well written, very smart, very entertaining, very fun science fiction. If you are into that sort of thing, then I very much urge you to give this series a try. And with that, folks, I'm going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.